Have you ever been lost? You weren't sure where you were going, or even which direction you were headed? That happened to me about 4 years ago. We had just moved to Colorado, and I was working and delivering for Amazon. And about 2 weeks in, I got my direction and said, "You're going to Black Forest." I didn't know anything about Black Forest, except I did remember the first day on my job, our owner said, "If you are ever in Black Forest and you see a mountain lion, do not get out of your van." So I made a mental note of that. So I drove to Black Forest and I started delivering, and it had snowed the night before, and so I could see paw prints in the snow. Some were very small and some as large as the palm of my hand. And my mind went into overdrive. Is that a large dog, which is bad, or is it a very large cat? Well, by an act of God, I finished my route without being eaten. I called our dispatcher, and he said, "Hey, don't come back yet. Lauren is near you. Go and help her." And so I did. By the time I arrived and took the packages, it was now dark outside and pitch black inside the forest. So as I made my deliveries, I kept my eyes open for large cat eyes lurking in the darkness. But I delivered all my packages, and it was time to head back. I now had a different problem. My device simply said, "Return to station." I had no clue where I was at. I had no idea how to get back. And so I tried to pull up directions on my phone, and I had no service. That feeling of being lost was setting in. So I started driving, not knowing which direction I was even driving. I drove and drove. My road ended. I now had to turn left or right. Your guess is as good as mine. I made a choice. That road eventually ended. So I did this multiple times. I don't know how long I drove around in circles, but eventually I came to a sign that said Falcon to the right. I had never been to Falcon, but I knew it was somewhat near Colorado Springs, so I took it. Started driving down that road, and I drove and I drove. Eventually, I did get cell service, and I could pull up directions back to the station. My boss, the owner of the company, was retired military. Before she started the company, she was a colonel in the Air Force. And as I was driving, she called me in her colonel voice and asked, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm pulling in right now." "Oh, okay." So when I walked inside, she was much more calm, and she said, "What took you so long? You finished your last delivery at whatever time it was." And I explained everything that happened, and I said, "This area is new to me. I had no idea where I was at or where to go. I didn't even know which direction I was headed." Have you ever had that feeling? You're in any new or an unfamiliar place, and so you start asking, am I on the right road? Am I headed in the right direction? Or maybe, how long will I be lost? It's not a pleasant experience. Sometimes we experience those feelings in a season of life. Life is changing and it feels different. It can happen when we prepare to graduate from high school and we ask, well, what college or what career should I choose? Or maybe a few years later as we graduate from college, what job should I take? Where should I live? In state or out of state, away from my family? It can happen in your 30s or your 40s. You're doing what you've planned on doing, but there's this uneasiness within, this restlessness, and you feel unfulfilled. Life is not going as you envisioned it. For many, it happens when the kids leave home. That role which consumed your life is now very different. And you ask, what will I do with my time? What's my purpose? Or maybe it's when your career ends and you say, what do I do now? How do I find meaning at this stage of my life? So the feelings of being lost can happen in a season of life, or they can overtake you after an event that permanently changes your life. Your company downsizes and you're out of a job. when health fails or a loved one dies, and life will never be the same again. And in those times we can think, what now? What should I do? What's my purpose? Is there something more? Mark Twain said, the two most important days in a person's life are the day we are born and the day we find out why. Today we begin a new series titled On Purpose. And for the next 6 weeks, we'll be looking at the book of Colossians to find answers to these questions. The author, the Apostle Paul, gives some insight. Paul's life is an interesting story. He lived the first half of his life with a very specific purpose. And because of his intense focus, he was successful, he was wealthy, and he was rising through the ranks. Then one day his life was just like turned upside down, and he realized that he had been headed in the wrong direction the entire time. Literally, Paul saw the light, and from that moment on, his heart was transformed and his life forever changed. The same was true for Peter and John and Matthew and Zacchaeus. In fact, everyone who met Jesus and responded to the invitation to follow him were never the same. They found a new purpose for living, a purpose beyond getting as much as I can, a purpose that gives true meaning and satisfaction, a purpose that changes values, pursuits, and perspectives on life. It brings a feeling of, this is what I was made for. Have you ever had that feeling? I remember when we moved from Heartland to North Branch, and Debbie had always worked with me in ministry at my side, always serving, but the church hired her as the children's minister. And in her new role, it did not take long for her to say, this is what I was made for. This is what I was created to do, to teach children about Jesus. Now again, she had been doing that, but now it became her focus, her purpose, and her passion, which led to her stepping out in faith and trying some new things. And as she did, God developed some new talents in her. It didn't happen all at once. It was a journey that God revealed one step at a time. And that describes what Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 1. Let's begin reading in verse 3. We always pray for you, and we give thanks to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. For we have heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and your love for all God's people, which come from your confident hope of what God has reserved for you in heaven. You have had this expectation ever since you first heard the truth of the good news. So let me ask you, does that describe your faith? Are you confident where you will spend eternity? You can be through Jesus. But in Jesus, we also discover our purpose for life and why God put us here on this earth. And Paul mentions one more amazing benefit, that we get to do life with some pretty remarkable people. I may have shared this story, but I remember when an elderly gentleman in our church passed away in the middle of the night. Our minister arrived in the wee hours of the morning, and he was shocked because he was not the first one there. Their life group, their small group, beat him to the scene. They had come to give comfort, support, and hope. I think we could all use friends like that. Verse 6, this same good news that came to you is going out all over the world. It is bearing fruit everywhere by changing lives, just as it changed your lives from the day you first heard and understood the truth about God's wonderful grace. The good news of Jesus changes lives. Transformation comes as we begin to see the truth about God's life-giving love for us. But what's interesting is Paul thought that he had a clear view of God. He was a Jewish teacher, a Jewish leader. He had lived every day of his life for God, serving God. The problem was his view of God did not include an accurate view of Jesus. But once it did, it changed everything. As I said, Paul literally saw the light and his eyes were opened. Earlier we sang, "Open the eyes of my heart, Lord." That needs to be our prayer every day. Open my eyes, Lord. Help me to see you in a real way, a way that will transform my life and give me true purpose. Because when we see life clearly, we will know God's will. Look at verse 9. "So we have not stopped praying for you since we first heard about you. We ask God to give you complete knowledge of His will and to give you spiritual wisdom and understanding." So according to Paul, God will give you complete knowledge of His will or His plan for your life. He will also give you wisdom and understanding to know how it applies to your situation. But here's the thing. God's wisdom is different than man's. His ways are not the same, and usually His timing is different as well. Man's wisdom draws conclusions based on limited knowledge, and then it takes action based on those faulty conclusions. It kind of reminds me of the story Max Lucado told about an old woodcutter. Although he was very poor, he owned a beautiful white horse. In fact, people had offered to buy the horse and paid a lot of money for it, but the old man always refused. One morning, the man went to the barn and the horse was not in the stable. So the villagers came out to see him and they said, "You old fool, we warned you that someone was going to steal your horse. It would have been better if you would have sold him because you could have gotten whatever price you wanted. But now, the horse is gone and you have been cursed with misfortune." The old man responded, Don't speak too quickly. Say only that the horse is not in the stable. That's all we know." Well, the people laughed because they always believed he was a fool, and now he had proven it. Days later, the horse returned. He hadn't been stolen. He'd run off into the forest, and when he returned, a dozen wild horses followed him back. Once again, the people gathered around the man. "You were right. What we thought was a curse was a blessing." The man responded and said, "No, just say only the horse is back, and that a dozen horses returned with him. You don't know if this is a blessing or not, because you see only a fragment. Unless you know the whole story, how can you judge?" The people knew he was wrong. I mean, come on, 12 extra horses. With a little bit of work, they could be broken, and they could be trained, and they could be sold for great profit. The old man had an only son who began to break the horses, and then he fell off and broke both legs. Once again, the villagers gathered around his father. "You were right. The dozen horses were not a blessing. They were a curse. Your only son has broke his legs, and now you have no one to help you. You are poorer than ever." The woodcutter just shook his head. "Why are you obsessed with judging? Say only that my son broke his legs. That's all we know. We see only a fragment." A few weeks later, the country went to war, and all the young men of the village were forced to join the army, all except the old man's son, because he was injured. And once again, the people gather around. This time they're crying and they're carrying on. "You were right. Your son's accident was a blessing. His legs may be broken, but at least he's with you. Our sons are gone forever." The old man stated, "You always draw conclusions, but no one knows. Say only that your sons had to go to war and mine did not. We see only a fragment. Only God knows." See, understanding God's will does not mean that suddenly we understand everything that's going to happen from here into the future. But what it does mean is that God gives us the wisdom that we need for today to deal with whatever we're facing right now. Life is revealed in fragments, one day at a time. We don't know what tomorrow holds. Only God knows. And yet, as we give Him each day, He gives us the wisdom to understand and the strength to carry out His will, His plan. This requires being in constant communication with Him and letting His Spirit speak to our spirit. And yet, it's not enough to know God's will. We must live God's plan. Verse 10. Then, after you know God's will, then the way you live will always honor and please the Lord, and your lives will produce every kind of good fruit. All the while you will grow as you learn to know God better and better. As you live God's plan, you know God better and better. So let me ask, is your lifestyle honoring to God? Does it reflect His love and His holiness? Are the choices that you're making pleasing to God? Knowing God's will should change the way that we live, because there is a big difference between knowing and doing. Imagine working for a company where the president called in all the employees and he said, hey, I'm going on an extended trip. I'm going to be gone for about a year. And while I'm gone, you're going to manage and operate the business. I will send emails regularly instructing you what to do. And then he leaves and he's gone for a year. And during that time, just as he said he would do, he emails often, communicating his desires and his concerns for the company. When he finally returns, he discovers everything is in disarray. Weeds have overtaken the flower beds. Windows are broken. The receptionist is dozing. There's loud music blasting from several offices. And rather than working, many are horsing around. Instead of making a profit, the business has suffered a great loss. And so he immediately calls everyone together. He says, come here. And then he says, what happened? Did you not get my emails? And someone raises their hand and said, yes, sir. We got every one of them. Look, we bound them in a book. Some of us have memorized them. In fact, every week we have an email study. Every week. And the president says, okay, but did you do any of it? Do? Well, no, we didn't do anything with it, but we discussed every one. There's a big difference between knowing and doing. Jesus said, the wise man hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. The foolish man hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice. Knowing God's will should lead to living God's plan. And in his letter to the Romans, Paul described true worship as a living and holy sacrifice. That true worship affects how we live. True worship thinks and acts differently than the world around us. True worship surrenders to God daily. And as we do, we get to know Him better and better. I read an interesting quote from Eugene Peterson, and he said, worship is an act that develops feelings for God, not a feeling for God that is expressed in an act of worship. Let me read that one more time. Worship is an act that develops feelings for God, not a feeling for God that is expressed in an act of worship. In other words, worship leads to feelings, not feelings lead to worship. We are called to worship, and we are called to give thanks in every situation. As we talked about last month, in every situation, not for every situation, but in all things, we are to give thanks and we are to worship God, even when we don't feel like it. Why do we do that? Because doing so changes our hearts, our minds, and our lives. Knowing God and living for God go hand in hand. And you truly cannot have one without the other. Living for God is the truest form of worship. And it is an incredible journey. Well, as we begin to understand God's will and live God's plan, we will experience God's power. Look at verse 11. We also pray that you will be strengthened with all His glorious power, so you will have all the endurance and patience you need. May you be filled with joy, always thanking the Father. So Paul prayed that they would be strengthened with God's power. What does God's power look like? Does it mean that nothing bad will ever happen to us? Does it mean that we will never face difficult situations or heartache? Actually, Paul says it's just the opposite. Paul says that God's power gives us strength to endure and to have patience during those times. So rather than give up, we keep going. Instead of throwing in the towel, we trust God and we wait for Him to answer. Rather than doubt and fear, we're filled with hope and joy and peace. When I think about God's transforming power, my mind goes back to a life group that Debbie and I were in over 30 years ago. And in the group, the leader asked, okay, what trial or what struggle are you currently facing? And I thought about that. Nothing came to mind. I can't think of any struggles right now. Can't think of any trials. But then it hit me. Now, if you would have asked us that question a year ago, Debbie and I would have had the same answer, and it was a major struggle in our life. But here's the thing. That struggle was still in our life that day, a year later, and we dealt with it every day. Yet that which seemed overwhelming a year earlier didn't seem to be that big of a deal any longer. And as I look back on our life, God turned that struggle into a strength which has shaped our lives in so many ways for good. Are you experiencing the power of God in your life? Are you finding peace and joy in the middle of the chaos? When overwhelmed, do you find the strength to endure when you feel like giving up? If not, you can. It requires knowing God's will and living God's plan, which is typically far different than most people think. I think most people envision God's plan something like this. We have $10,000 and we lay $10,000 on the table. We say, okay, Lord, here's my life. I am giving it all to you. But the reality for most of us is that God says, well, okay, but I want you to take that $10,000 and I want you to go to the bank and I want you to cash it in for 10,000 $1 bills. And then we go through life and we give out $1 or $5 or $20 here and there, one at a time. We see God's will, and then we live it out daily. We don't play God, we play for God by living out and sharing Jesus' love little by little, day by day, with those that we meet. And as we do, we will understand His will, and we will begin to experience His power, His strength in our life, which will lead to more trust, and in turn, we will know Him better and better. See God's will, live God's plan, experience His power. That's how we discover our purpose in life. In the book Alice in Wonderland, Alice asked the Cheshire Cat, would you please tell me which way I ought to go from here? Well, the cat replied, well, that depends on where you want to get to. And she said, well, I don't much care. And he said that it doesn't matter which way you go. People often ask, what should I do? Where should I go? And the answers that we come up with will depend on our starting point and our goals. In the 1700s, a deadly plague appeared in a small village in Lithuania. And the people who contracted it would go into this very deep sleep. Most people died within 24 hours. Some made a full recovery. The problem was, it was difficult to tell which ones were asleep and which ones were dead. Well, one day it was discovered that someone had been buried alive. As you can imagine, the townspeople were upset, so they called a meeting to make sure it didn't happen again. And after much discussion, they agreed on the following solution. They would put food and water in the coffin next to the people, and they would also drill a hole up through the coffin, up to the earth's surface, so they could breathe. And those procedures would be expensive and time-consuming. However, it would be worth it if they could save lives. A second group came up with a quicker and less expensive idea. This one was not voted in favor of. But they proposed attaching a 12-inch long stake in every coffin lid right above the person's heart. As soon as the coffin was closed, there was no doubt whether the person was dead. Why the drastic difference in solutions to the problem? The questions used to find them. For the first group asked, what should we do in the event we bury somebody alive? And the second group asked, how can we make sure that everyone we bury is dead? Are you asking the right questions about your life? Because your future and your happiness depend on it. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this day. God, as we go about our life, and we all ask these questions at times, where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? Lord, what is your plan? And you don't give us just one plan for a lifetime, but you reveal it one day at a time in fragments. I pray that we would ask the right questions, Lord. I pray that we would ask with the right heart and the right attitude, because you will and you do reveal yourself to us. We thank you for that. We thank you that in Jesus we find true life and our reason for living, our reason for dying. God, give us your direction. Open the eyes of our heart. In his name I pray. Amen.